everyone. I'm Kelly Weiss. I'm the Director of Marketing and Communications at the Law School, and welcome and thank you for joining us for our Election Day preview event. We have a great panel of speakers, and Dean Johnson is with us as well. I'm just going to run through some quick housekeeping items. We're going to have everyone on mute throughout the presentation, and then we will be taking questions and answers at the end of our speakers. Those questions will come through the chat function, and then I will read the questions to our panelists. So I'd now like to hand it over to Dean Kevin Johnson to introduce our event for today. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and thank you all for being here to consider and think about some election day issues. Now, the 2020 election has been in the news a little bit over the last few weeks. We have a fair number of important elections going on, from the president to the states to local offices, and in California to some initiatives. Surprisingly enough, one of the initiatives that's getting the most attention is the one looking at the distinction between employees and independent contractors, which becomes clearer why it's so explosive in some ways when you look at its impact on everyday life for many people. Now, Election Day is November 3rd. We have some time to think about it. Mail voting is ongoing nationally, and we're incredibly fortunate to have a group of King Hall professors who will discuss a variety of topics that really may be affected by the voting results. And I want to introduce them and introduce their topics. They'll speak in alphabetical order. We have Professor Raquel Aldana, who is teaching immigration and criminal law this semester. And she'll be talking about the 2020 election and the promise for immigration and criminal justice reform. We have Professor Ash Bhagwat, who will be talking about the future of the administrative state. We have Professor Christopher Elmendorf, who will be talking about voting rights in the US Senate. We have Professor Lisa Ikamoto, who will be talking about healthcare law and reproductive rights and justice. Actually, that's been a topic over the week in the Judge Coney Barrett confirmation hearings. And last but far from least, we'll hear from Professor Lisa Pruitt, who will be talking about rural and working class white voters in the year of Trump. Again, thanks to our panelists for being with us today, and thank you all for being here. Professor Aldana.
Thank you so much, Dean Johnson, for your vision in organizing this event. Also to the DEI office for promoting it, and really to the King Hall staff for all the amazing work they do behind the scenes, and all of you for joining us today. So President Trump built his first campaign successfully among his supporters around the idea of building a physical wall between the US and Mexico. And nearly 4 years into his administration, this wall, while not physical, is really one of the most effective and potentially enduring successes of his administration. Rather than bricks or metal, the wall has been built with over 400 executive and agency actions that have included a range of policies and practices that are essentially shutting down the border and also impacting those inside the border in significant ways. These measures predated COVID-19, and President Trump relied on the so-called emergency powers well before the health crisis, such as when it significantly reduced the number of refugees, enacted travel bans for Muslim and African countries, and shut down the border for Central American asylum seekers, and also treated them cruelly by separating families from children in the name of so-called national security. Now the health crisis has only expanded these emergency powers, though even here, President Trump has chosen to rely on the economic crisis as his rationale to expand restrictionist policies. Two recent reports by two important immigration think tanks are worth mentioning. To give you a sense of the specifics, I encourage you to look them up. The first was published in July 31 of this year by the Migration Policy Institute, and it catalogs the 400 plus, yes, you heard me correctly, 400 plus immigration executive actions that have occurred during the Trump administration. The second is a recent report cataloging 100 plus immigration policies undertaken through multiple strategies that include bilateral agreements, executive orders, and also formal rulemaking undertaken by the Trump administration, published by the Immigration Legal Resource Center. And both the New York Times and Cato Institute followed up with some critical data and analysis to provide some perspective on the impacts of this agenda. And on October 13, so just 2 days ago, Cato issued a report titled, "No year has seen legal immigration cut like the second half of fiscal year 2020. And frankly, the data is staggering. And just because of time, the bottom line is that overall legal immigration to the US is down by 84% from last year, which was already down significantly from 2017. And in the second half of 2020, the numbers are even starker, with a 92% drop as compared to similar data from previous years. Numerically, we're talking about fewer than 270,000 arrivals in general in 2020, in contrast to about over 1 million in recent decades. The same was said by the New York Times on October 10th in an editorial by the editorial board and an opinion by the editorial board titled "Trump's Overhaul of Immigration is Worse Than You Think." And basically the data point they use is that between 2016 and 2019, annual net immigration into the US fell by almost half to about 600,000 people per year. And these are levels that have not been seen since the 1980s. So these reports and other analysis also coincide that the effects of these changes, even if Trump loses his re-election bid, will be with us for a long time. The LA Times this morning published a story titled "Trump Immigration Changes Will Affect California Long After He's Gone," referring of course to Trump. And I'll briefly spell out why. First reason is that the reductions of migration flows are going to be with us for a long time, because even if Biden comes in, COVID-19 is still with us. And the reality is that overwhelmingly all nations in the world have shut down their borders. And so even if the rationale is different, I don't see us reopening the borders quickly. Of course, the impacts will have staggering impacts over time because migration flows have a pipeline. And so, for example, family-based immigration depends on sponsors. And so the fewer family members who are migrating, the fewer who are going to be able to sponsor. Some of these changes have been formalized into rules, and undoing that takes a process and it takes time. The other reason is that the immigration power is subject to very little judicial scrutiny because it's a plenary power. And even on a good day, you don't get a whole lot of relief from the courts. And of course, the shift in the composition of the courts toward a much more conservative leaning is going to make it very difficult to really utilize the judiciary to curtail some of these policies. I also think that Biden winning is not enough because this area requires a political response, and it's been stagnant for decades. We can't even get the DREAM Act passed. And so it's not just enough to win the presidency. We have to capture the Congress if anything is going to change, if you want things to change. Biden also has a huge agenda, and it hasn't appeared that immigration is really at the top, with some narrow exceptions like dreamers. And so I do want to suggest that I'm not clear that this will be a transformative area for him, given all of the other priorities. And I also frankly want to state that Biden may be a continuation of Obama policies. And the reality is that President Obama was not especially progressive on immigration. He still retains the title of deporter-in-chief in the history of the US. And I'm not sure that Biden is necessarily going to be a significant departure from that. Let me move to criminal justice. The first thing I want to say is that in contrast to immigration, which is still a federal power, policing is largely, though certainly not exclusively, a local function. And much of the conversation about criminal justice reforms is really an agenda for the states. By no means am I suggesting that the feds are irrelevant in this effort of reforming criminal justice, even in terms of the local levels. And of course, the feds have their own issues, especially with the horrific ways in which immigration and federal law enforcement has been functioning in recent years. But leaving that aside, if we just focus on the feds vis-a-vis the local policing functions. Let me give you a few points in the ways that the feds do matter to this agenda. Perhaps the most important is setting the tone. The influence of the president in this regard cannot be overstated. President Trump's treatment of Black Lives Matter and other similar movements, in contrast to his treatment of white supremacy groups, is both palpable and worrisome, and it has had a significant influence in the country. The second is that there is some power for federal oversight, particularly in egregious and systematic policing misconduct. And in the past, certainly President Obama did step in and procure some important settlements that led to some changes in local policing, at least in some local jurisdictions. Of course, federal reforms to federal policing can have an impact on local reforms. And I know that, for example, Harris in the last campaign mentioned getting rid of chokeholds and so on and so forth. I'll wrap up soon, Dean Johnson, I saw it. The other thing that I want to highlight is that depenalization or decriminalization is a huge area of criminal justice reforms. And this is where I think the feds can have a huge impact. They just are out of touch, right, with what is happening, for example, with the treatment of marijuana. And the marijuana treatment as a Schedule I drug in federal law is really impacting the broader reforms that are necessary. And so even that, getting rid of that would be significant. And most certainly decriminalizing even marijuana at the federal level would have a huge impact. And then finally, funding. So funding, right, has an impact. The feds have money and they either give it or retain it depending on how they view states. And they could also do other things like stop selling military equipment to local police. And so there's a lot that can be done. But again, and I'm going to finish here and I won't get into the specifics. I'm happy to answer questions. But because this is also a local issue, keep in mind that there's a lot of local propositions on the ballot that bear directly on issues of criminal justice. And I'm happy to answer those during the question and answer period. And beyond those that are directly related, I think there are also policies that have social implications on issues like access to higher education and housing. And criminal justice reforms cannot be thought of purely in terms of criminal justice, but also in terms of broader social policy. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Professor Bhagwat?
Thank you for organizing this, and thank you all for attending. I'm going to talk about the administrative state. It's a big topic, but as people who study con law or admin are aware, but most people are not, we are right now at a major tipping point in the nature of the federal administrative state. Most of the reason for that is the courts. But again, the administration matters because, for example, Judge Barrett's confirmation to be Justice Barrett, which I assume is going to happen very, very soon, is going to shift the center of the court significantly to the right. In particular, it's going to remove Brett Kavanaugh from the center position on these issues. So what am I talking about? First of all, one of the overwhelming trends of the last 20 years has been the politicization of administrative law. Historically, the assumption had been that agencies made regulations, which is most of the law that currently implements federal policy, through an expert process taking account of science. The White House provided general oversight, but wasn't really involved in the day-to-day decision-making. That truth has been eroding for many decades. Bill Clinton was really the person who drove that process. Elena Kagan ironically wrote the iconic Law Review article illustrating that. But in the last 4 years, the politicization of agencies has accelerated a lot. For example, President Trump in the Trump administration, have been using executive orders to try and have a much more politicized role in hiring, for example, administrative law judges, the people who actually implement regulatory law. And the Supreme Court signed off on that in a case called Lucia versus SEC 2 years ago, written, I believe, by Kagan. And the Supreme Court also is moving towards eliminating independent agencies. One of the major checks on presidential influence over agencies is that many of the most important agencies, like the Federal Reserve, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Federal Communications Commission, are independent, meaning that their heads cannot be removed by the president at will. They serve terms of years. The Supreme Court in a case called Sela Law last year basically provided a broadside hint that it was going to hold independent agencies to be unconstitutional, which means that presidential control now spreads from the agencies he now controls to the entire administrative state. The consequences of this are on display. Frankly, if you look at all of the sort of fights over the COVID-19 stuff, the CDC not being able to issue guidelines based on science, basically ignoring of science across the board by the utter loss of faith that the United States has had in government science agencies, that is all a product of the politicization of that process and the White House exercising direct control over even what would have historically been considered completely scientific decisions, such as health measures, which I think before this administration would always have been left to the experts. And the process, if it continues, is going to really threaten the integrity of the regulatory system. And that is very troubling. Now, and I want to emphasize, while it has gotten worse in the last 4 years, certainly presidents before, Democratic and Republican, Obama, Bush, Clinton, all have contributed to this process. But it is now accelerating in a very troubling way. And one hope one has is perhaps a Biden-Harris administration would be a little more hands-off. Perhaps, no promises. The second threat to the administrative state is actually existential. In a case called Gundy versus United States, 4 conservative justices, Kavanaugh did not participate, he was still being confirmed, strongly indicated that they were open to reviving something called the non-delegation doctrine, a body of law that's been dead since the 1930s, but that puts severe limits on Congress's ability to authorize agencies to make law. If they are serious, and if they have a 5th vote, and I suspect in Justice Barrett they do have a 5th vote, they might have had it in Justice Kavanaugh, but I think Barrett is a pretty clear bet because she is such a strict originalist, unlike Kavanaugh. The Clean Air Act goes away. The Clean Water Act goes away. Much of the modern federal regulatory apparatus goes away because all of it relies on broad delegations of authority to agencies. That would be a revolution which would take the United States back legally to before the New Deal. I don't know that the court has the stomach for that. I would have thought that Chief Justice Roberts would be hesitant, and yet he has been the leading the charge in this area. So we sit at a precipice, some of which depends on this election and some of which does not. It actually depends on the confirmation vote, which is going to happen this week or next week. But that is, I think, what we are facing today, and it is really profound. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Elmendorf?
Yes, it's really nice to be here. Thank you, everybody, for attending. So one of the reasons why there has been so much politicization of the administrative state is because it's very difficult to get things done through what everybody acknowledges should be a political process, namely the legislature. And one reason it's really difficult to get things done through the legislature is because of the filibuster. That's probably the primary reason it's difficult to get things done through the legislature. That is, the Senate has adopted a rule that says 60% of the senators are needed to pass most legislation. So that gives a strong minority veto to the minority faction within the Senate. Beyond the filibuster, the Senate is, I would argue, like the central problem with American democracy. And to understand why it's such a problem, you need to appreciate something that has happened throughout the Western democracies over the last 100 years. And what that something is, 150, 125 years, is large-scale ongoing migration from rural areas to urban areas, associated with the Industrial Revolution and then more recently with the knowledge economy. And second, increasing ideological polarization between people who live in rural areas and people who live in urban areas. And most of the Western democracies accommodated this phenomenon by adopting systems of proportional representation, which allow geographically concentrated urban voters who tend to support parties of the left to obtain representation in proportion to their numbers. The US did not. And the reasons why the US did not adopt a system of proportional representation early in the 20th century or the middle of the 20th century are complicated. But in any event, it didn't happen here. And beyond our failure to adopt proportional representation through the House of Representatives, we have an even more fundamental problem, which no Western democracy has, namely the US Senate, and the requirement in the US Senate that each state be equally represented with 2 representatives. And if people's political preferences weren't correlated with population density, then the Senate wouldn't be a problem. I mean, there would be like maybe too much pork distributed to small states, but it wouldn't be a big problem. But to the extent that people have strong ideological preferences which are correlated with population density, the Senate and the equal representation of states, the fact that Wyoming has the same number of senators as California, becomes a big problem. And there are not any easy solutions to the problem of the Senate. I think it's going to be something that we struggle with over the next generation. There is a short-term hope, which is that if, due to the enormous unpopularity of the current president, Democrats are able to win a rare majority in the Senate, which basically means winning by 7 to 8 percentage points in the median state. If Democrats are able to win at this one brief moment in time a majority in the Senate, they can get rid of the filibuster. They can admit DC and Puerto Rico as new states. But even the admission of DC and Puerto Rico as new states would only modestly reduce by about 1/3 the current pro-Republican bias in representation in the Senate. And at the same time, a Democratic Senate could pass a new Voting Rights Act, which would provide for nonpartisan districting and thus better representation in the House of Representatives going forward. But these are deep structural problems that are going to be really hard to solve. To my mind, the long-term solution for the Senate is something like population-weighted voting within the Senate, so that each state would continue to have 2 representatives, but those 2 representatives would cast votes on matters within the Senate that would be weighted by the state's population. But population-weighted voting in the Senate is certainly unconstitutional on any kind of originalist reading of the US Constitution. And even apart from that, would probably be hard for any Democratic majority in the Senate to adopt because, put it this way, the Democratic representatives from Maine are probably not going to support it. So I'd be happy to take further questions in the Q&A, but we're dealing with a really, really difficult problem in our democracy that extends far beyond our current president.
All right. Thanks very much. Professor Ikemoto.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining our conversation. And now that we're all cheered up, I'm going to talk about healthcare law and reproductive rights. Dean Johnson mentioned that the Barrett confirmation hearings have been, in part, a debate about the role of government in healthcare. And in large part, there's been a lot of focus on the upcoming hearings in the case called California versus Texas, which is scheduled for the week after the election. So that's really, it's a mandate. It's a conversation about the validity of the Affordable Care Act. And I can talk about the Affordable Care Act and what's at issue in that, the specifics of that case in more detail in the Q&A. But it's sort of undeniable that the Affordable Care Act has expanded healthcare access for tens of millions of people. So Biden's proposals would expand access further by largely if Congress would pass it, providing a public option. Trump, on the other hand, has said that if the Supreme Court terminates the Affordable Care Act, it would be, quote, a big win for the USA, close quote, with a lot of caps and exclamation marks. As I said, we can talk about the details of those issues in the Q&A, but I want to mention in a minute or so 3 other issues that are basically also at stake that have to do with healthcare. So one is the public charge rule. This isn't expressly a healthcare law, but it's a rule that says that if a person applying for a visa or lawful permanent residence status in the United States has been a quote unquote public charge, the Department of Homeland Security can deny their application. So public charge is further defined as a person who has received one or more public benefits for a period of 12 months during a 36-month period. That includes Medicaid, as well as a couple of other essential services for people. It's been suspended during the period of the pandemic, but that rule's been challenged and may go before the Supreme Court shortly. It's an example of what Professor Bhagwat was talking, the results from rulemaking, highly politicized rulemaking. The second example I want to mention is that recently, in June of this year, the Trump administration, or the Department of Health and Human Services, following up on an executive order, narrowed civil rights protections that are included in the Affordable Care Act. And the rule does so by eliminating gender identity, sex stereotyping, and language access as bases for protection. And the third example I want to provide is religious exemptions. The idea of religious exemptions in healthcare are not new, but they've been substantially expanded to the point where they swallow the rule that healthcare providers are supposed to provide full scope medically necessary care for their patients. And these exemptions have been created by providers, for providers as against their patients, and for employers as against their employees. So then quickly, that turns us to reproductive rights and justice. And there's so much going on there that it's hard to go into any detail. So what I'm going to say about this is that here's what you can do for now. Vote and fight for the right to vote for all. And when you vote on every elective office on the ballot, and for each candidate ask, what is their position on reproductive rights and justice? So it's very possible, of course, that the Supreme Court will either overrule Roe versus Wade or narrow it even further. I mean, it's already pretty narrow as it is. That's going to have two broad effects. One, of course, is on access to abortion in the states that refuse to protect it in the future. The other one is basically, it's about status, social and political status of more than half the population in the United States. The status of women, especially women of color and people marginalized by sexual orientation and gender identity. So in a world like that, anybody who is pregnant, fertile, might become pregnant is fair game for government intervention in a pernicious way. So consider, for example, the investigation of people who experience a stillbirth or miscarriage. Prosecution of pregnant women who attempt suicide and fail. Those are actually based on recent prosecutions. And those would become more common in a post-Roe world. So who gets elected as district attorney matters. Another example is that local and state officials can increase funding for abortion or implement comprehensive sex education. So every official on the ballot matters. When you vote on these candidates, consider also whether you hope to support that local city council member if they run for state legislature in the future, or would you support the district attorney you're voting on when she later runs for state attorney general, and then for the US Senate, and maybe later for the presidency of the United States? So most of the attention right now has been on the top offices, but all of them matter for reproductive rights and justice. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Pruitt.
Great, thanks. I'm going to try to share my screen here. Let's see. Is it working? No, wrong screen. Let's see. Can you see the PowerPoint slides? I'm guessing no. Yes, you can. You can see them. Okay, great. I'm getting false signals from my setup here. So I'm going to do something completely different, not surprisingly, as I usually do, and not talk about the law and what's at stake for changes in the law under a Trump administration, much of which we've already seen, and devastatingly writ large for 4 years. But I'm going to talk a little bit about how we got where we are. And I'm not trying to ignore what Professor Elmendorf said about rural voters, and I'm happy to circle back to that and how his talk and my talk are linked in the Q&A. So one could say I'm in an unenviable position here, but I've done it to myself because I have been writing about rural and working class white voters for about a dozen years, actually longer than that now. And I do that in part as what some people would consider a dual national. That is, I grew up in what is now Red America, before it was Red America. I grew up in rural Arkansas in a working class white family, and now I'm a coastal elite. So I have sort of lived my life straddling between these two factions that are, currently battling, supposedly battling for the soul of America. By the way, this photo is one that I took a few days after Election Day 2016 in El Dorado County, California, which is just to the east of Sacramento. So I want to say, don't shoot the messenger. I'm here trying to explain. I've voted Democrat my whole life, for the Democratic Party my whole life, but part of what I think explains this divide and why so many people in my current world don't understand this divide is because what it means to be a Democrat has changed a lot. What it means to vote Democratic has changed a lot over 50 years, and it has changed in time and place. So don't shoot the messenger. That's one of my messages. And the second message is that really to encourage people not to stereotype, right? We have foisted a lot of blame on the rural and white working class voters for Trump's election. And yet there are lots of identity variables, including geographic ones, that go into how people vote. Here are two screenshots from recent rural political activity. One is in Nebraska, where you can see there are farmers who support Biden. And the other is of an arson attack on a farm display in rural Massachusetts. So we had rural people who were supporting Biden, Harris, and then we saw what happened to them. Okay, let's see. Oh, there we go. The other thing I hope some of you are aware of is that there has been an enormous amount of Black Lives Matter activity in rural America this summer. So a couple of screenshots here. I wound up writing 5 or 6 blog posts about rural Black Lives Matter activity this summer because there was a lot of it. And it had journalists asking, wow, is Trump losing hold on rural voters? Another example, recent Missouri Medicaid expansion. Most of the mainstream media we saw were saying, yeah, it passed, but it passed in spite of rural votes. But in fact, for people who were parsing this at a finer degree of detail, no, this would not have passed. We would not have had Medicaid expansion in Missouri were there not a whole lot of rural voters. So we really need to be very cautious when we assume that all rural and white working class voters are Trump voters, because I think we risk alienating, that is we, being progressives, liberal elites, whatever title we want to take on, we risk alienating these voters, those who are swing voters, right? So if we look at the 2016 exit polls, we see that the people, the income category, and this is not broken down by race or ethnicity, that voted for Trump by the greatest margins were actually people who earned between $50,000 and $100,000 and between $100,000 and $200,000. And he also got a heck of a lot of support. He tied with Clinton for support among those we might consider rich. So contrary to sort of the popular narrative, right? And depending on what you define as working class versus poor, it isn't who we tend to assume who voted for Trump in the greatest numbers. In fact, just to illustrate the point that we can slice and dice the electorate in a lot of different ways, maybe we should talk more about the gender gap, right? We blame it on rural and working class white voters, but we could in fact decide that we're going to blame it on men. because men support Trump more than women. In fact, here's a headline from the New York Times, I think it was yesterday or the day before, talking about, the fact that 30 to 32% of male Latino voters support Trump, and that's about what it was in the prior election. And now if we look at what the polls show us, women are flocking to Biden away from Trump, apparently in much greater numbers. So that last column over there shows you the women's vote in lots of different polls. We have women flocking to Biden. And here's a great tweet from Bill Kristol, the conservative commentator, a few days ago. I've been amazed at how often I wind up retweeting Bill Kristol in recent years. He's become like this extraordinary voice of reason. And, you see a huge gap in the extent to which women are flocking to Biden versus men flocking to Biden. So my point is, right, we can slice and dice the electorate on lots of different identity characteristics, and we probably ought to be a bit more cautious in foisting the blame on any one group. Now, a lot of people on this call are students, although I want to mention that I'm happy to see a lot of alums on this call as well. So some of you are too young to remember Barack Obama's Bittergate comment, which was kind of his equivalent of, of Hillary Clinton's basket of deplorables moment. And I bring this up not to shame Obama, because I think that actually his explanation of his comment is something that we should all take very seriously now. So his comment was, and he was referring to rural voters in Pennsylvania, they get bitter, they cling to guns and religion, or antipathy to people who aren't like them, or anti-immigrant sentiment or anti-trade sentiment as ways to explain their frustrations. But then he explained, right, because he had been, making this comment off the record at some private fundraiser in, San Francisco. I was actually making the reverse point, clumsily, which is that these voters have a right to be frustrated because they have been ignored. And because Democrats haven't met them halfway on cultural issues, we've not been able to communicate to them effectively an economic agenda that would broaden the coalition. So what I see in the era of Trump is a lot of unhelpful rhetoric. And I will admit that in the early days of Trump's presidency, I too was kind of, retweeting all sorts of negative things and saying all sorts of negative things about Trump voters. But, then I kind of backed off and said, no, I'm going to criticize Trump, but I'm going to be more hesitant to criticize or paint with too broad a brush anybody who might have voted for Trump, because I think there are swing voters in there who can be attracted back. But you see people saying the darndest things. First of all, assuming that, again, that all rural and working class white people voted for Trump, and really being very cruel and harsh. So here was a story from last year about, farmers who are complaining about the damage that Trump's trade war has done. And Marcus Bertone, who's the columnist for the Sacramento Bee, says, well, they voted for him. And I just want to make the point that that's really unhelpful, right? If our goal is to attract some of these voters, as my mother used to say, you catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. And then you get these very harsh things like this other tweet that is from 2017, not by someone as reputable as Marcus Bertone. Whoops. Let's see, I'm not able to go to my next slide. But that's a fair enough place to stop. I do want to mention that the additional slides that I had are actually, oh, here's one, about organizations that are active in organizing in rural communities. And these headlines, I think, really speak volumes. That when progressive voices and progressive organizations go into rural communities, they really are able to make a difference. So here's one organization, and that's Professor Ian Haney-Lopez of Berkeley in that photo. And another organization is George Goyle's People's Action, which has been very active in organizing in rural communities. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Kelly, do we have questions?
We are opening the chat now, so I will let you know when those come in, but please send them to me, Kelly Weiss, and I will then present them to the panelists.
Did any of the panelists have questions for other of the panelists?
Well, if they don't, Dean Johnson, I do have the first question that's come in. That is from Barbara, who writes, it would be good to hear some perspectives to the census and the impact of its early termination.
I'm happy to speak to that. The early termination of the census is going to have a devastating impact on communities of color, and it's going to have a devastating impact on rural communities. And it will come as a surprise to many people, but there's a lot of overlap. So I have spoken today as if working class whites and rural are synonymous. A lot of people talk that way. It is in fact not true. So the communities that are probably going to be hurt the very worst by cutting off the census are Native communities, the Latinx communities in the Rio Grande Valley, African Americans in the Black Belt and the Mississippi Delta. It's the rural poor who are most likely to go undercounted, which isn't to say that a lot of other people won't be grossly undercounted by this early termination of the census in this remarkable year where the pandemic has made it so hard to get people counted in any event.
I'll also add that another huge population that's going to be undercounted is immigrants. And, you know, it was a strategy that began early with the inclusion of a citizenship question that really provoked tremendous fear and deterred many people from participating in the census. And it's been a long and ongoing struggle because there's been litigation around whether immigration status should preclude people being counted for purposes of you know, representation and other kinds of allocation concerns of power. And, you know, we won that lawsuit barely, and then it's been now a political attempt to undermine that litigation since. And I think this is very, very real. And I think the ultimate goal is not just to reduce migration significantly, but it's also to disempower completely, because of course non-citizens can't politically participate except through the representation that they gain through the census. So it's completely to disenfranchise a community that is already incredibly disempowered. This is the most dangerous thing that I think is coming down the pike.
And I think that part really was done months ago by the citizenship question that the Trump administration tried to ask. I don't think that the early cutoff of the census is going to have much of an impact on immigrants because they were scared to death to begin with. Months ago before it ended early. It's not going to help the counting, obviously, but I think, as Professor Aldana mentioned, the die was cast with a citizenship question, and then the executive order about reapportionment and districting and the like, and people, immigrants in the rural areas, as Professor Pruitt notes, they're hiding out, but so are the ones in the cities.
Can I just add one more comment? So the Census Bureau conducts the decennial census once every 10 years. It's required by the Constitution, and it's used for apportionment of representation in Congress among the states. But the census also conducts, under statute, another survey called the American Community Survey, which is not an attempt to count everybody. It uses statistical sampling, so it counts a sample of the population. But the American Community Survey is continuing. So we'll eventually be able to compare the numbers from the American Community Survey with the numbers from the decennial census and figure out how bad this census was. And if it turns out it was really bad, then perhaps some of the programs for which funding is distributed according to the decennial census may be revised so that funding is distributed instead according to the ACS.
I would also just add briefly, I cannot think of a situation where the census has been dispoliticized before. And when I talk about the politicization of the administrative state, this is probably as prime an example as any I can think of.
Okay, we have our next question from Kumar, who says, ask the panel if they have comments about the unofficial ballot boxes that have been popping up in California, and how is this not illegal?
I can speak to that. It may be, so the Republican Party, the California Republican Party has placed so-called drop boxes for ballots in various places around the state where they're trying to get make it easier, I guess, for Republicans to vote. Some of those drop boxes apparently had a logo on them or language on them to the effect that they were official drop boxes, and that is illegal because that's representing that a privately established ballot drop box is in fact a official voting location, and so there's some misappropriation of the logo of the state of California for which that's unlawful. But in California, it is not illegal to collect and return ballots that have been cast by somebody else. So this is a practice that is called sometimes derisively ballot harvesting. And some people are very concerned that it's prone to fraud. On the other hand, some people think it's very necessary as a way of enabling voting during a pandemic. But California is one of a handful of states where it is allowed. And Democrats have been trying to get the courts to allow it in other states as an accommodation to voting during the pandemic. And by and large, the courts have shot down those requests.
I didn't know that. That's interesting.
Okay, next up, a question from Bara, who says, is there increased, with the increased activity by the right-wing militia, do you see that increasing even more if Trump loses? And if so, what can be done to counter that?
Well, I'll have a first go at that. I mean, based on what I read by credible sources that study these right-wing militias or terrorist groups, I think we're now questioning, should we be calling them militias? Is that really an appropriate term? We should be, no, they're terrorist groups. I'm based on, again, what I read from the experts, I'm pretty worried about this. I'm pretty scared. In fact, I just, well, I mean, I don't want to overstate it, but I did just sign up last night to be an election watcher, a poll watcher in Washoe County, Nevada. And, if there's anywhere the militias are going to show up, it's probably going to be Nevada. There's a lot of them based there. So I'm thinking, well, this could, at worst case scenario, right, be interesting. But again, based on what the experts say, I think it's a problem, and that things may get worse. And I think we have to count on, and this is where I'll defer to my criminal law and administrative state and constitutional law colleagues. We have, among other things, we need to be able to count on the federal government to intervene and protect us. And can we do that now? Can we count on the federal government? Can we count on the DOJ?
I do want to speak to that a little bit also. I suspect what I say is not going to be very popular, but conservative groups have a right under the Assembly Clause just like everybody else. And they're allowed to gather in public places. It's a First Amendment right. Allowed to do it in groups. It's a First Amendment right. I wouldn't allow them to be armed, but being armed in public is legal in many states. I think that's crazy, let's be clear, but it's true. There isn't a whole lot we can do. The reality is that the distinction between assembly and intimidation is something that we have been fighting over since the 1790s and not resolved. We're not going to resolve it now. But it's a really hard question because the assembly right is in the Constitution. It is not reserved to any particular group. in the past, assembly has been used to intimidate by the left and the right at times. It is being done pretty aggressively right now, but I don't know that there's a lot of legal solution, unless of course you cross over the line into violence, in which case I do worry with Lisa, are we actually going to enforce the laws against, riotous assembly? But short of that, I don't think this is a solution really.
I'll say just a few things in response to that. I agree that there are rights to assembly at play. There's also the Second Amendment issues that we need to grapple with that are intersect in this conversation. But I do think tone matters, and I think that one of the things that has happened in the last 4 years, because I do want to say I've been studying hate groups for a long time, and the truth is white supremacy groups have existed in this country forever. And part of what has happened is that they have become emboldened, but also more visible. And the coverage, I think, in part because of the political climate, has been greater on some of the things that they have been doing. But I don't think it's accurate historically. I don't have specific data to show growth, but I don't think it's accurate to say that this is by no stretch of the imagination, a new or an explosive phenomena that doesn't take into account the historical roots. And I think part of what's happening is a different climate. So I do think if Biden is elected, which is how I understood the question, I do think the rhetoric will change, and whether that will be enough, I don't know. But I do think it's not just the rhetoric, and I think it's the enforcement piece. And quite frankly, I'm still kind of shocked by the different treatment that we give people who engage in this type of quote unquote assembly rights. And the prosecution of the young man who was carrying this rifle openly, and the ability to fundraise millions of dollars and then to be able to move his case to a jurisdiction that might prove a little bit friendlier to his cause. I mean, all of these things are worrisome, but I think they happen in a political climate, a political context. So at a minimum, I think we will get an administration that will change rhetoric, and I actually think that matters.
Okay. We have a next question here that's kind of goes on what we were talking about, protecting the vote. And Chad writes, there are numerous opportunities for lawyers to help protect the vote. What can law students do?
Well, when I signed up to be a poll observer last night, one of the questions asked on the form was am I a lawyer, or am I a law student, or I guess am I a layperson? So that clearly tells me that this organization I've signed up with, which somebody's supposed to get in touch with me to schedule me, right? They see law students as being in a valuable category in the same way that lawyers are. So, there are probably, that we can be trained, right? I've never been a poll watcher before. So I'm assuming somebody's going to tell me, pretty much exactly what to do. And they're going to expect that my knowledge of the law and legal principles is going to equip me, slightly more than the layperson, but certainly law students can do that as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Can I add something? This doesn't apply to this election, at least for most of you, unless there's something I don't know. But, I hope that many of you run for office in the future. And certainly in those positions, right, you can act to protect the right to vote.
Great. Dean Johnson, do we have time for one more question?
Certainly.
Okay, so we'll have this as the last question. I saw a couple coming through the chat asking about the Electoral College. And one question specifically says that if Biden does win and the Democrats take control of Congress, do you foresee there being a change or actually getting rid of the Electoral College?
I'm happy to take that very briefly. No. The only way to get rid of the Electoral College is by amending the Constitution. 3/4 of the state legislatures have to ratify an amendment. That is never happening because the small states simply will not do it. So It's fine to talk about as Chris was talking about the ills of the Senate, which I completely agree with him. It's fine to talk about the ills of the Electoral College, but it's not going away. A reform that could happen, and I think would be good, would be that instead of allocating electoral votes statewide, as a couple of states do, have each congressional district have a separate electoral vote, and only have the extra two, representing the senators, be allocated statewide, because that would mean that Democrats in Texas living in cities would have a voice, and Republicans in the Central Valley of California would have a voice. That's a good thing.
But Ash, do you think that Congress could do that?
Yeah, I had a very long conversation with my family about that, and I think the answer is no.
Yeah, I think the answer is no.
Well, and you can't go first. California can't go without Texas going, because otherwise the Democratic Party would be disarming itself. So no, there's a problem.
The problem exists because the Constitution says the electors shall be appointed in the manner chosen by the state legislature. Apologies for the background noise there. The dog objects to the manner of which the Constitution was written. And there's litigation now about whether that even allows, say, for a state Supreme Court to review what the state legislature has done, or to measure what the state legislature has done against the state constitution. But I don't think Congress can establish a method for states to allocate electoral college votes.
I agree. Frankly, the nightmare scenario for me is in some state, Republican-controlled state, in which Biden wins narrowly, the state legislature then appoints an alternate slate, which could easily happen. It's clearly part of the playbook right now, and I don't know what happens then. It's because if we go to the House of Representatives resolving the election, it's vote by state, not by member. And there are more Republican delegations than there are Democratic delegations, even when there are more Democrats in the House as a whole.
So I have a comment that might help bridge that question, my comments earlier and Professor Elmendorf's comments. And really, I think some sort of reform where we, however it happens, and I understand the restrictions that my constitutional law and election law and administrative law colleagues are articulating. I mean, there needs to be some reform where rural areas don't wind up overrepresented. And I completely appreciate that. But, Professor Elmendorf, you spoke earlier about how in Europe, some of these problems have been, headed off as we had rural to urban migration. They simply, changed the representation so that it was kept in line. And we, haven't done that with the Electoral College and the Senate. But we saw the same rural backlash across Europe at the same time we've seen it in the United States. So the backlash has happened. It happened with Brexit. It's happened in Poland. It's happened across Europe. So this phenomenon is about more than the overrepresentation of rural people in the United States.
Oh, just to follow up on that, my comments were just about how polarization is translated into representation. I didn't mean to say there was anything distinctive about the polarization in the US, because you're absolutely right. The polarization has happened throughout Western Europe, and it's been dramatic, in the last few years, but it's actually a much, much, much longer term phenomenon. It's been happening in various ways for generations, really since the Industrial Revolution.
Well, it's past 1 o'clock. Thanks to our panelists, and thank you all for being here. And we're all looking forward to election 2020. Take good care.